S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to veľmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samote. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba.
Hello and welcome everybody to this debate on the topic of global climate in a state of emergency with Graham Maxton. Graham, who is joining us from Taiwan, I believe, is a former Secretary General of the Club of Rome, worked also for The Economist, and is a prolific writer. He wrote 7 internationally acclaimed and translated books, 2 of which have recently also been translated into Slovak and published by Pro Media. His latest book, titled A Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg, How COVID-19 Can Solve the Climate Crisis, is published this month and will also be available in Slovak early next year. My name is Michal Sedlačko. I'm based at the University of Applied Science at FH Campus Wien in Vienna and working on issues of sustainability planning, public participation and knowledge in policy and public administration, and I will moderate this discussion. We have 1 hour and we are also willing and able to take in questions from the audience. But first of all, how are you, Graham? What time is it over there?
Dobry den, Michal. It is 10 o'clock at night here, so I'm actually sitting here in my pajamas waiting to go to bed.
Okay. So let me start with the famous Club of Rome report, which was called Limits to Growth, published in 1972. During the time of the rise of environmental movements in the Western countries. And in one of your books, which was quite interesting, you stated that the message of the book was not properly understood and that it failed to change influential sectors of the industry. So why was the report unsuccessful? What was the reason for inertia then, and is it different today?
So I think it's important, first of all, to understand what the book said. The book is often portrayed as a forecast for the future. But what it actually was a series of scenarios which said that if we carried on developing our economy and growing our population at the rate we were doing in the 1960s and early 1970s, then the world would hit a barrier around 2030 where the entire system of human development would collapse. And they ran these different scenarios with different assumptions, and in almost every case, the system of human civilization collapsed in the first half of this century. What happened is that the book came out in the early 1970s, and of course, it had only been a few years before that man had landed on the moon for the first time, and it was still the end of the hippie era, and there was a great deal of optimism about the future. And so when the book was published, it seemed to be simply unbelievable that where we were going was going to lead to a catastrophe or a crisis. Then, a few years later, Ronald Reagan was elected to be president of the United States, and Margaret Thatcher was elected in Britain, and both of them were extreme neoliberals who believed that growth was the major policy that economies and countries should pursue. And so everybody pushed aside this book, Limits to Growth, and said there are no limits. Ronald Reagan was famous for saying there are no limits to growth, referring back to this book. And so everything that was published in this book was ignored or criticized or said to be a forecast, which it wasn't. And so the book was quickly dismissed. In fact, I would recommend anybody who has not read the book to read it today. This is fresh and is useful even now, 50 years later, nearly 50 years later, as it was when it was published in 1972. And in my view, and in the view of many other people, it is coming true. What was predicted in the book is exactly what is happening. And we see it with the effects of pollution, but also with climate change. Climate change was predicted in the book as an outcome of us pushing too hard on the economic accelerator, and we have created economic devastation as a result. So the book was criticized, but is actually proving to be very accurate.
Well, one of the issues that I generally have with the environmental movement is that the environmentalists frequently seem to have an unrealistic understanding of how the political system works. This is also related to the report and to the impact of the report. I believe that the environmentalists mostly tend to think that missing knowledge of environmental issues is the main reason why then systemic environmental issues are sidetracked. And so explaining and awareness building and making politicians realize the seriousness of the situation will lead to good decisions, they would believe. However, I would argue that as a society we possess sufficient knowledge. We are aware of the problems and of what is at stake. So why then do you think that we fail to address them? What is wrong with our political systems?
I mean, you're absolutely correct. I've worked in the NGO community for much of the last 10 years. My wife worked in the NGO community. And there is a sort of broadly held belief that if we simply keep explaining the information differently, or if we collect more information, then the politicians will suddenly wake up one day and say, aha, we have an enormous problem and we have to change. And of course, they haven't done that. And it was certainly interesting for me when I became involved with the Club of Rome that almost none of the members had asked themselves, why are we failing? Why have we not achieved have we not achieved any major change despite all our efforts for the last 40 or 50 years? And I think the reasons are, it's not just the politicians, it's that we've become convinced, or societies have become convinced, that they must have economic growth. This is partly because of a group of economists in the late 1940s who influenced Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and a lot of people since then, to make us believe, it's almost like a religion, to make us believe that we must have very little regulation of businesses, that we should be focusing on economic growth. And by focusing on economic growth, we actually create the climate change problem. We create the environmental destruction. But because we have come to believe that we must have economic growth, we can't conceive of any policies which will slow that rate of growth down or damage our economic systems. So the first barrier, I think, is the economic system. We're all kind of brainwashed into believing that we have to have this economic growth. I think there's also a certain fear of change. People don't like change. I mean, I think within the last generation, there has been a lot of change in Eastern Europe. And so people perhaps have more openness to change. But in much of the West and in the United States, there has been very little radical change in the since the end of the Second World War. And so there's a feeling that anything which is going to disrupt the status quo is going to be problematic, and nobody wants to embrace that. There's a sort of natural fear of change. And I think another reason that we have a problem is that democracy actually gets in the way. It seems like giving everybody the same vote is a good idea, but unless everybody understands how urgent and how serious the climate change problem is, they're not willing to vote for change. And so we have a situation where the experts, the scientists understand what's happening here very clearly. They understand how urgent the climate change problem is. And yet a large percentage of the people who vote don't understand how serious it is. The politicians are elected for a short time. They don't want to risk their future by doing something which is economically destructive. And so we have a system which is simply unwilling to change. It's locked in this view towards economic growth. The democratic system makes it very difficult for us to change that system, and we have this fear of change. So it's not a lack of data, it's the system which prevents us from making the right decisions.
So if I would follow up on your issue of economic growth, if I may. So economic growth would give most of the people who are let's say moderately well off, who lead materially decent lifestyles, be they middle classes, upper classes, entrepreneurs. So economic growth gives a certain decent lifestyle to these people, and these people obviously, as you also pointed out, also because of the fear of change, would be afraid to to act against their own interests. Now, the question is, you also mentioned democracy as a kind of a problematic area. But the question is, so what is the role of the governments in a situation where it actually has to act against numerous short-term interests in the society, existing in the society? So where does actually the government get the accountability to act in order to safeguard long-term public interest?
I mean, to some extent here you're talking about theories of governments and what the role of government should be. But I think, put most simply, the role of a government is to protect the long-term interests of the majority of people. It should be there to serve the democratic majority. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. Where we have the situation we have now is that if you look at the different sort of groups within societies, you have the business sector, you have individuals, you have NGOs and other institutions, and you have government. Now, which of those can solve this very complicated long-term scientific problem, which is that the atmosphere is heating up because of the way we produce energy and the way we grow food? Businesses can't do it. There's a lot of propaganda put out by big corporations that turning green and being more sustainable is going to save us all from some environmental catastrophe. But actually, that's nonsense. Businesses are driven purely by the economic system, which is to maximize short-term quarterly returns. That's all they do, and anything they do which gets in the way of that, anything which costs more, they will be penalized by the market, by the stock markets, and by consumers if their prices go up. They're driven only by short-term profit. That's the system. That's not a criticism. So businesses cannot solve this problem. NGOs and other non-governmental type organizations like universities have no power. They can't solve this problem either. Now, there's a lot of talk that you and I as individuals can solve this problem, that if we become more responsible consumers and we fly less, which is easier with this virus, if we take trains, if we recycle our rubbish, then we can change the system. But actually, that's nonsense. The effects of even everybody in Europe becoming green tomorrow and living without any emissions at all would not change the future. It's not the Europeans only produce 10% of the world's emissions. If the other 90% of the world carry on as now, that won't change anything. When you have countries like China and India and Russia creating vast quantities of emissions, as well as the United States, whatever happens in Europe, we can't change the future. And so the only people that can actually change what's happening, the only people who can be a solution to this problem are government. It has to be regulators. Now, I'm not saying it's the current governments. I think we need to change the people in charge. We need to bring in much younger people and people who have got a much better idea of what's happening with the atmosphere. But government is the only group in society, I think, that can solve this problem, and we have to depend on them to think of our long-term interests. I can see that as the only way forward.
I would perhaps now, however, also touch upon the issue of individual responsibility. Most of environmental activists are driven by certain motivation, driven by the vision of a better future. However, if you are an environmental activist or scientist, and you have been working on the issues for a decade or more, you see species and ecosystem dying out every day. You see how much we have already lost since the 70s when the issues became pertinent. And, as a society, we constantly accelerate into an irreversible crisis, which is actually already becoming visible, already starting to unfold around us. So how can a person stay optimistic? How can you actually continue this struggle to continue putting pressure on the government every day to not resign and, to not just experience climate anxiety? Where do you personally get your motivation?
I think that's actually the most difficult question to answer, because it's very difficult some days when you look at what's happening to the Arctic ice, or you look at what's happening to the wildfires in California or Greece or Australia, and you look at the rate of die-off of species, it's sometimes very difficult to remain positive. But I think we're beginning to see a genuine shift in political opinions. We're beginning to see a movement in many countries and an awakening which is encouraging. In fact, COVID-19, this virus, is also gives me reason for optimism, because it's in destroying big parts of the economy, in undermining the aviation industry and the automotive industry, and many other parts of the transportation industry. We're actually seeing emissions beginning to fall. In paying people when they're being furloughed and are not able to work, we're beginning to see a system which allows for a transition where people don't have to worry about having a job. So I think we do have an opportunity here, and I think that's what keeps me optimistic. You said about acting as an individual. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you should do nothing. What I'm saying is that you can only succeed by acting collectively. As an individual, no matter how environmentally sustainably I live, I will not change the future. If every American and every European suddenly becomes 100% green tomorrow, that will not change the future. We need to act collectively. We need to inform others. The most important thing that you can do as an individual is help other people understand. This book that's published this month, A Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg, and which will be published in Slovak in a few months, provides a fact sheet, and it gives a lot of ways that you as an individual can help inform other people. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your parents, and have them tell others how serious the situation is, so that we can build a much greater awareness of the scale of the problem, and we can build a political movement for change. That's what we can do. As individuals trying to save trees or animals, that's not going to change anything. We must act collectively.
Well, I would actually return, if I may, to the topic of the COVID-19 crisis, which you just mentioned. There has been also a question from the audience regarding this. So we have seen through recent crises, be it the 2008-2009 economic crisis or other recent crises, we have seen that economic elites usually benefit from a crisis. Every such a recent crisis has led to redistribution of capital and power, and to an even further opening up of the gap between the super rich and the lower and middle classes. So how so is the COVID-19 an opportunity? How can we act now differently and to achieve different outcomes than with previous crises?
Of course, you're right. The 2008 financial crisis and many other big events in history have increased the gap between rich and poor. And that's exactly what's happening now. And this is to me an opportunity for us to waken up, to realize that our governments have been failing us for a long time. I know in Slovakia that people are being tested for this virus last week, and that there's a great deal of, the organization seems to be very good. But in many other parts of the world, the organization has been dreadful. The response in many parts of Europe, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, has been appalling. It has been chaotic. You've been able to see how absolutely, without any heart, the capitalist system is. It really doesn't care about people. It cares about business and not the health of individuals. Couple that together with the environmental crises that we're facing. This is a time for us all to waken up and realize that the political leadership we've got in most of the world today is failing. It's not doing what the majority of people need. It's not protecting their health. It's not protecting their welfare. It's not protecting their incomes, and it's not stopping climate change. We need to have a political change, and I see the coronavirus, despite all the failures that have happened so far, as a time for us to waken up and realize that we need to have a radical structural change in our societies and our economies, not just to cure the virus, not just to stop climate change, but if we're to have any future, we need to change the system. And this is, I think, the chance for us to waken up and push for change.
from my experience and perception that after the first wave of COVID crisis, especially, you could feel some kind of a opportunity for reflection. A lot of people seemed to started asking more difficult questions around what is the purpose in life. So obviously, I would agree that the COVID crisis can be an opportunity for rethinking what do we expect from our economic and political systems. And as you also mentioned, it's also leading towards shrinking of the economy in some aspects, in the aspects of tourism, in the aspects such as transport. So if we want to reinforce these tendencies and follow the path of degrowth to, ensure that some polluting industries are closed down, you even yourself argue in one of your books that Formula One racing industries should be also affected because it is even not moral actually to burn so much fuel for fun when the planet is on the brink of burning, or literally burning even during the recent forest fires. So, but how can we achieve that when we shrink the economy, that it is going to be socially equitable? How can we ensure that it will not lead to widespread unemployment and massive suffering for exactly those lower and middle classes?
And of course, your question is absolutely correct, and we must start this transition process with a clear vision of what we want to achieve in terms of equality. There is a false belief that economic growth reduces inequality. Again, this is another part of the myth of this strange religious system that we've got, which encourages us to focus on economic growth. We believe that growth will increase jobs and that it will reduce inequality. In fact, that's total nonsense. If you look at the gap between rich and poor in the rich world, it's bigger today than it was a century ago. And if you look at the gap between the rich world and the poor world, it's bigger than it was 200 years ago. And these are OECD numbers. These are from the Club of Rich World Countries. So the economic system actually increases inequality. It pushes wealth from the poor to the rich. But we're all fed a message which says it does the opposite. The famous French economist Thomas Piketty, his whole book is about how the system increases inequality. So this is a question about how we choose to run our countries, how we choose to run our societies. We have to make a decision to rebalance. Now, if we're to reduce the pace of climate change and reduce emissions, we need to radically downsize our standard of living in much of the West. The idea that we can carry on consuming at the rate we do today is simply not possible. We have to go back to a standard of living that is certainly in places like France or Germany, more like it was in the 1970s, where we consume much less, we travel much less, we live more simply. It doesn't mean we have to go back to the dark ages, but we have to go back to something which is much more sustainable. We also need to make sure that we redistribute the wealth that there is, that we tax the rich more and that we tax the rich world more, so that we can allow the poor world to have some sort of better standard of living than we have today, than they have today. It is not ever going to be possible for us to, for the people of India or China to live at the same standard that people do in Germany or Bratislava today. And we have to accept that, so we also have to manage expectations. How we do that is first of all, we need to stop climate change. The most important thing we need to do is stop climate change. So the number one goal for all these people who come together to act to try and create change must be to stop climate change. And that has to happen regardless of what that means economically. So stage one is to stop climate change. Stage two is to try and reimagine the economic system. And that will take a long time. The development of the system we have today took several decades. We need the same sort of development process now. So we need this period of time where we close the polluting industries, we pay people by the state, like we did after the financial crisis, so that they have a source of income, and then we begin to build a new sustainable economic system, which is entirely different from the system we have today. We can't do it in one step. The first thing and the most urgent thing is to stop climate change.
Well, this very nicely links with a question which a member of the audience has asked on the automotive industry, saying that Slovakia is the country with the highest number of produced cars per capita in the world. So what is the future of the industry according to your view?
I'm very pleased that somebody's asking about the automotive industry, because it's one industry that I know particularly well. I covered the automotive industry as a journalist for many years. The automotive industry is a very important industry. It accounts for, all in, a very large percentage of the GDP of many countries, not just Slovakia. But it's also indirectly responsible for a huge amount of pollution and a huge amount of energy use and a huge amount of use of scarce resources. And it is simply not possible for us to carry on living with the auto industry as it is today. We have to shut the fossil fuel industry, we have to shut the aviation industry, and we have to shut the automotive industry for the large part. Now, that sounds very scary. And so what we need to do, first of all, is make sure that the people who work in that industry don't suffer. We need to make sure that they are paid a basic income which allows them to live as they do today, so that they are less worried about the closure of the industry. The number one goal must be to reduce emissions. We must reduce emissions of all the greenhouse gases, and those produced by the automotive industry are a big part of the problem. So the goal must be to reduce emissions. How we do that is where I think we have to be very careful and think and plan ahead, so that the people in the automotive industry are protected by a safety net, so that the employees, the workers in these industries don't suffer. They can still feed their families, they can still have a roof over their heads. What happens to the investors is a different question.
If I may, I would raise another question which came from the audience, which also touches upon this kind of prognostic dimension. There is a question if there is any possibility to calculate or guess economic consequences of climate migration in the future. Do you know of any study? Do you have any particular ideas?
You mean migration of people from
Yes.
places where they can't live? I haven't seen a study that shows the economic consequences of that. We know the economic consequences and the difficult political consequences that came from the wave of migration a few years ago from the Middle East. Of course, Germany was particularly far-sighted in its response to that, but it did create a lot of political tension in Europe. And what we can expect to see in the next 20 years, even in the next 10 years, is a lot more migration from parts of the world which become either too hot or too dry, or for other reasons uninhabitable. Areas around the Mediterranean are particularly susceptible. North Africa, Australia, parts of the US will become very difficult places to live over the next 20 years. And we can expect a lot of migration from these areas. There will be other parts of the planet that will become better to live in. I think about places like northern Canada or parts of Siberia and Russia, where the temperatures will mean that it will be easier to live in these places. So we're going to see a large migration of people because of climate change. Now that creates a lot of political tensions, it creates a lot of economic tensions, and it will create a lot of military tensions. And this is one of the reasons why I'm saying we need to begin thinking about all of these issues now. I know the German military and the US military have thought about this in detail because they understand the security implications of this. But we all need to begin to plan ahead to work out how we're going to respond to that. It is not simply going to be possible to put up barriers and say nobody can come in, because the numbers of people will be too great. And so we need to find a way to think this thing through first, so that we reduce the amount of potential for conflict.
I would still like to return to the question of possible solutions, or what areas, what trajectories do not allow for a solution. There has been a question asked by the audience: to what extent can we rely on the capitalist economic framework to solve this crisis? I would perhaps reiterate or add some details and embellishments to the question, and that is, you already said that businesses cannot be expected to solve the problem. Businesses are there to generate profit for the shareholders, and they generally lead towards exponential growth, towards raising the scale of the economy. So we have certain ownership and institutional structures which together with the idea of endless growth, actually link us or close us in a specific trajectory. And I guess in this direction could the question be interpreted. So what's your opinion on this?
Okay, I don't want to sort of plug this book, but so this book, this published, is called "The Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg," and the Slovak is going to be exactly the same. Now, to answer your question, I need to explain that. So these are the words of the human rights and black rights activist Malcolm X. And he said in 1964 in a letter to an Egyptian newspaper that a chicken can't lay a duck egg. And what he meant by that is that a system which is designed to do one thing can't do something else. So a chicken is designed to lay a chicken egg, it can't lay a duck egg. A duck needs to lay a duck egg. A chicken, it's impossible. And in exactly the same way, a system which is designed to maximize short-term profits and maximize the rate of economic growth cannot solve our ecological and climate change problems because it's not designed to do that. It's designed to move wealth towards the rich. It's designed to maximize profit. It's designed to maximize growth. That's all this capitalist system does. It's very simple. In the process, it destroys the planet. It creates the greenhouse gases that increase the temperature and pollute the atmosphere. And it uses up vast amounts of energy and resources. Now, that's what the system is designed for. If we want to fix our environmental problems, if we want to slow the pace of climate change, we need a different system. It's not a question of changing the capitalist system a little bit and trying to make it a bit more friendly. We've tried that for years, and it's got nowhere. The system, the environment has got progressively worse, the climate change has got progressively worse, and so we're now in a crisis. The capitalist system cannot solve climate change. We need a different system.
Now, this is a very powerful message, obviously, but let me just play a devil's advocate for a bit there. There have been arguments since the 70s already going back to the limits to growth and the debates between economists such as Herbert Simon and so on, that capitalism is a system which is extremely innovative, which produces solutions towards to the crises and problems that it encounters. Now, we have also seen that capitalism actually managed to solve issues such as local pollution. People are living well and better off also in terms of environmental capital and environmental conditions in many countries and many places of the world. So is capitalism capable of producing a technological solution to climate change?
Okay. I'm very pleased to ask this question. So first of all, capitalism has shown itself to be very flexible. It's shown itself to be very innovative, and it's shown itself to be very strong and robust against change. But it hasn't fundamentally changed what it's doing, and it can't. It can't stop its focus on growth. You talk about local pollution problems being solved, and it's true. The rivers are cleaner, the air is cleaner, at least it's less visibly dirty. But a lot of the reason for that is because a lot of the polluting activities have been moved to other countries. They've been moved to Southeast Asia, or they've been moved to India, or they've been moved to China. And so what the system has done is simply move the problem somewhere else, or it's filtered out the air pollution so that what we see today doesn't look dirty, but it's actually far more dangerous. The amount of water pollution, the amount of plastic in the oceans is continuing to grow. So it's not actually solving the problem. There's also a great deal of propaganda put out by the system, by economists and by the finance community and by investors who don't want to change. And so they keep telling you that the system is going to be able to solve these problems. The system cannot solve this problem because it's not a technological problem. It's not a problem which is this is a problem which has been caused by capitalism. It's been caused by the focus on growth. The problem is a social problem. We can try and clean up the atmosphere, although technologically that's going to be extremely difficult given the level of pollution. But the problem is that we are deciding not to fix it. As a society, we're continuing to create this pollution. We're continuing to focus on growth because we don't want to fix it. We don't want to change our economic systems or the way we live today. And so we're continuing to make the problem worse. There is this great idea that there's going to be some magical technological fix. So two kids in their garage in California are suddenly going to come up for a way to clean up the atmosphere. It's not going to happen because technologically, the scale of the problem is far greater than we can ever imagine. We have to accept that the capitalist system, the banking system and the finance system has been trying to tell us that they can solve this problem for 20 years and it's got worse. We cannot look to the capitalist system to solve this problem. We need a different system.
So I will pick up another question from the audience. And that is that people act on emotions or beliefs and they ignore critical rationality. Yet your change that you propose would rely on large-scale, significant awareness building, which then leads towards a powerful political movement which puts pressure on the government. How can we do that? We have just witnessed the elections in the US and the power of not only fake news, but also of simply lies and manipulation. So, and even outright malice, perhaps. So, how can we actually, under current conditions, with the current social media, mobilize into a global and powerful political movement? I think we might have lost our speaker, might have lost Graham there for a bit. So let us wait for a second if he manages to reconnect quickly. Thank you for your patience, everybody, and thank you also for your questions.
S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samote. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samote. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samote. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samote. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samoci. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samoci. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba. S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výnimočný rok.
Spolu alebo o samoci. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba.
We are back. Due to technical difficulties, there has been a small break. Thank you, Graham, for joining in back. And I would just quickly reiterate the last question. How can we mobilize and organize an effective political movement given the current social media and the polarization in the society caused by fake news?
This is not easy. Of course it's not easy. If it was easy to change the system, we'd have done it by now. The only way I can see it first going forward is by acting collectively. We have to come together and we have to put pressure on the politicians, and then we have to change the politicians so that we can take the steps that are necessary to rebuild the economic system. Now, the problem is that we have a wide group of people who are all trying to act individually, who are all trying to solve the problem as consumers, and there are very few people who are coming together. When they do come together, they come together in a very disorganized way in NGOs, in movements like Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future. We need to be much more organized. And so the first thing we need to do is create awareness. We need to raise the level of understanding of the problem, which is why I say the number one thing you can do is get informed, understand the scale of the problem, and learn the facts like you're getting ready for an exam. And then go out and tell others and try and persuade others so that they understand how serious the problem is. And then once you've convinced them, get them to explain to others so that we and build understanding, and that way we can build political pressure. It's a step-by-step process, but it can happen quite quickly. There is a fact sheet in one of these books which will help you kick you off, and a series of instructions as to what you can do. The only way we can change the system is by acting collectively. But we have to inform and communicate first, and that's the first step that everybody can focus on.
You made one powerful statement that is that an individual cannot really change the future in terms of his or her environmental lifestyle. Yet we have a large and growing group of environmentally conscious people who don't use cars, who eat vegan, who try to minimize their ecological footprint, cohabitate, whatever. At the same time, and that you mentioned that the key players, the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, those will be the countries which will determine the future of our climate. So it seems at the same time, I would say, that environmental concerns and values, to some extent, seem to be a function of the society's wealth. The wealthier the society is, the more it holds environmental aspects in higher regard. Whereas for more powerful, more poorer people, it would seem that they have more immediate concerns they to care for the environment. So how would you what is the future you see of environmental activism and movements in these countries, such as Brazil, India, China, and perhaps even US?
Okay, I think one of the calculations I did for this book recently was to work out that if I personally, as a citizen of the rich world, stopped everything I do which emits greenhouse gases and lived entirely sustainably, what difference would I make? We have about 12 or 15 years before we kick off a chain reaction in the atmosphere, which we will be unable to stop. The temperature will continue to rise for centuries, and most of the planet will become uninhabitable. So if I as an individual suddenly become 100% sustainable, what effect will I have on that chain reaction? I'll slow it by about 1/5 of a second. So we all have to change, not just in Europe, and not just in America, and not just in the rich world. And you're right, the people in the poor world have to change as well. What I think we need to do is set an example. We need to set an example and lead by example, and show that we're willing to redistribute, show that we're willing to live differently, that we're willing to take the steps that are necessary, and encourage other countries to follow. You're right that the environmental movements in many of the poor countries are not so well developed, and it's a bit of a luxury of the rich world to care for the environment. But these poor countries are going to be affected much faster and much worse than the rich world, and they'll be much less able to cope with it. And so, I mean, you see in India already, I mean, major cities are going to run out of water within a few years. I mean, places like Delhi and Mumbai are having serious water problems. Chennai, and so they will suffer much more than we do in Europe, as will parts of Central America and North Africa, and many parts of China. Rising sea levels will have a huge effect on China. And so I think if we set an example, if we show the way, we will find that much of the poor world will come with us, because they will see the need much faster. The problem right now is somewhere like the United States, where even although we have a new election, a new president, the United States is still reluctant to come along, and they're responsible for 15% of emissions, despite having only 4% of the population. So again, we need to put political pressure on our allies to make sure that they come along as well. But in Europe, we should set an example and have others follow. The poor world will come along, because they're going to be most badly affected by this problem.
I would follow up on the American elections. To what extent do you believe that the current president-elect is going to be able to change and mobilize Democratic Party for such a systemic change project as you sketched out earlier? To what extent is there readiness, even though Biden said that on the first day of his presidency he will actually sign the Paris Agreement? But to what extent is Paris Agreement actually sufficient, and to what extent is there the perception of the necessity for a radical change in the US?
I mean, I think what's happened with the United States and Biden is a very positive sign. I mean, we do have the chance now that America will come back into the international group that wants to try and fix climate change. But America remains a very divided country. Biden did not win by a huge margin. There are still a great many people who are against change of this sort of measure. And even if America does join the Paris Climate Accord, and even if every country meets its obligations that they've given for the Paris Climate Agreement, it will change nothing. You know, Paris is amazing because lots of countries have agreed. It's dreadful because what they've agreed is not enough. It will not avert a catastrophe. What we need to do is bring these countries together and set much more ambitious targets. So I think I welcome what's happening in America, but we're a long way away from America leading here, or from them being able to take the steps that are necessary. The leadership has to come from Europe.
You mentioned, or we rather talked about technology and not putting too much hope into technology. We were mentioning that decreasing the level of material excellence is simply a necessity. Let me now get to the third point or the third variable of the iPad formula, the evergreen of environmental thinking, meaning that the environmental impact equals the amount of population, the size of population times the material effluence times the technology used to produce that said effluence. So what do you think about the population? There has been a large discussion in the 60s, also in the deep ecology movement, in the development movement, and obviously because of post-colonial concerns and because of political worth of the topic and how value-laden the topic obviously is, the debates are not really continuing. Do you think that the Earth can feed 8 or 9 or 10 billion people?
As you say, the topic of population is very controversial. It has been for many years. When the Limits of Growth was published, it was compared often to the works of Thomas Malthus, the minister from England in I think the 1750s, who talked about too many. But Malthus and the Limits of Growth are both correct. There is a sustainable level that we can have in this world, a sustainable number of people. If we all want to live like Europeans, then it's probably around 1 billion people. If we all want to live like people do in India, then it's about 10 billion people. So we have to control the population, and we're not doing that. It's a very difficult thing to control, it's very controversial, but we've roughly doubled the population in the last 60 years. It's increasing by nearly 100 million people a year, so every decade about 1 billion people needing more food, water, housing, waste management. I mean, we have an enormous problem with our own population. So part of the economic plan has to be to think about how we manage that. We can't change that problem now. We have 8 billion people. It is growing by 100 million a year. There is no quick fix. Climate change will solve part of the problem for us because it will result in many problems for hundreds of millions of people and shorten their lives. But it's something that when we begin to think about a new economic system, we need to think about very carefully. How do we limit the human population so that it's sustainable and so that everyone can live with decency and with a reasonably high standard of living? We can't escape this question.
Now, the environmental discourse, to a large extent, obviously, mostly to people who actually are not environmentalists or do not share environmental values, seems to be a very restrictive regulatory discourse that prohibits us from having fun. And generally limits our freedoms. That is how the right paints the environmental concerns, isn't it? So, but my question would be, what is the utopian vision towards which we should transform? How, for you, does a sustainable society look like? How does it feel like? How does it smell like?
What makes us happy is really very subjective, and it's defined from one generation to another. What makes us happy is not necessarily determined by how rich we are. There's a lot of people who are very rich and very unhappy. If I think about the way my grandparents in Scotland did, they didn't have a very large house, they didn't have a lot of clothes, they didn't have a new phone every few months, they didn't take exotic holidays, they spent their time playing golf and going to church and doing all the things that they did together as a family. They didn't have a huge carbon footprint. They didn't consume vast amounts. And they were very happy. It's a question of what you expect and how your neighbours are living and changing your values. If I look at people in Southeast Asia, for example, it's true that in the last 30 years, a lot of people in places like Thailand or Vietnam have been lifted out of poverty, according to The Economist. I mean, they've been taken out of a situation where they earn next to nothing working in fields. But they've been put into a situation that is much worse in many cases. They have to work 15-hour days. They have a very hand-to-mouth existence. They get paid very badly. They get exploited by the people that employ them. And so they've moved from a situation which was relatively stable, in which they were, in many cases, happier than now, into a situation where they're really very unhappy and exploited. So it's a question of adapting and our values and what we think of as important. And we've changed that before, and we need to change it again. We need to think about what makes us happy, not our level of material consumption.
Now, my impression of the transition in the Eastern European countries over the course of the last 30 years is that a lot of people stopped feeling solidarity, stopped feeling trust towards the state and public provision of the quality of life, and instead of relying on individual income as a means to achieve happiness, to essentially be independent from the society, to be able to afford 2 cars, holidays, a house, and so on and so forth. How can we, in such a culture that develops in such a materialistic and individualistic way, how can we argue for conviviality, for sources of enjoyment and flourishing and happiness, which are not based on material consumption?
I'm very pleased you asked this question as well, because one of the things I didn't mention earlier on is that one of the important parts of the capitalist system, the neoliberal system, is that it deliberately creates a greater sense of individualism. This goes back to the Pellerin Society and a number of people from the Austrian School of Economics. Encouraging individualism makes it easier to lower the level of regulation, to make people, it atomizes society. It reduces the chance of people acting collectively, which makes it much easier for the big corporations to dominate. We had a much stronger sense of cooperation, not just in Eastern Europe. 20 years ago, when I was a child in Scotland, my parents, my grandparents, there was a much greater sense of community. And that's what we need to find again. And again, what I'm saying about acting collectively, about coming together, about forcing political change, about raising awareness, is about acting collectively. We are stronger together. It's divided that we fall. And the economic system we have today knows that, which is why it tries to separate us and make sure that we don't act collectively, because it makes it much easier for them to control us.
This reminds me of a statement by Colin Crouch, who said that the current crises and problems awake a pressing need for a primeval need for the public, for us actually to be able to find an articulated political community which acts as a body, which acts collectively. And that seems to me to be the main avenue of how you foresee change. And if the governments are serious about serving the people and see those communities and that such communities emerge and put pressure on the government, that it would actually follow long-term interests of the public rather than of a narrow elite. It's a very optimistic vision. Is there anything you would like to add or embellish on what I just said?
Yes, I mean, I think that what was the former Soviet republics, what was Eastern Europe up until 1989, I think you can set an example. You're closer to understanding how these two systems work. You've seen one system which didn't work, you've seen another system which doesn't work. When I get involved with people around the world, I see more questioning of the system in the former Soviet countries and what's today Eastern Europe, more understanding of the need to change the system. And I think, if Slovakia or your neighbors are to do anything, you can begin the debate that we so badly need to have about how we should run our societies and what sort of economic system we should have. So, really it's over to you to help us fuel this debate.
Well, thank you very much for this final message. It was really great having you, Graham. It was a great pleasure. I also have to say that I'm thankful to the audience and to the audience for raising questions that we were able to brought into the debate. Thank you for your time, despite the very late time in Taiwan. Are there any last words you would like to say?
No, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. This is part of what I do to try and help people understand that we need to have radical change. And even if just a few of you think that you can be part of that, then I've done my job tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to your new book being released in Slovak soon. Good evening.
Thank you.
S nimi alebo bez nich. S nami alebo proti nám.
Je to velmi výjimečný rok.
Spolu alebo o samoci. Teplo alebo teplejšie. Zostať alebo odísť. Tvoja voľba.